The following presentation was a live webinar where leaders of the Islamic, Christian, and Hindu faith came together to discuss how their religion responds to issues of race and injustice given the social tension of our time. We hope that if you find this video informative and inspirational, that you would like and share it so that others may be able to learn and grow as well. Thank you.
All right, everyone, it's a little past 7 p.m. Welcome everyone to Race and Injustice. What's faith got to do with it? Of course, race and injustice is a pretty hot topic right now. Many of us are watching the news and wondering if people of faith are to blame. We felt that this was a great opportunity for students to learn more about how each faith responds to this question that society is facing. So we have leaders from Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism here tonight. So we're going to hear some differing opinions, but hopefully walk away with a better understanding of these matters at hand. My name is Arti Krishna. I'm here on the behalf of UIC Design, and I'll be your MC for this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly thank our sponsors that made this event possible. First, we have the Design Movement, which is a South Asian American college student community that seeks to honor Jesus and celebrate Desi culture. Then we have MSA at UIC. They aim to create a safe space for all, regardless of faith or practice, in which they feel welcome, involved, and attended to, and using the space as a foundation to build a thriving community centered on Islamic principles. Third, we have Neighborly Faith, a place where college students can live out their personal faith and convictions, but also learn to be great neighbors with those that they disagree with. And last, we have the Veritas Forum. The Veritas Forum helps students and faculty ask life's hardest questions. The Veritas Forum is committed to courageous conversations. So welcome again for everybody that's just joining us. Again, I'm Arthi. I'm your MC for this evening. We have about 100 people so far, spanning, I think, 8 different religions. So it's great that all of you are here. We're really excited to have you. So next, I'd like to give a brief introduction to each of our panelists. So first, we have Sheikh Tariq. Sheikh Tariq is a graduate from the prestigious Medina University, where he attained his associate degree in Arabic and bachelor's degree from the College of Sharia. He completed his memorization of the Quran at age 13 and went on to receive ijaza from Palestine. He studied classical Arabic at Fajr Center in Egypt. Sheikh Tariq is now the youth director and assistant imam of Mecca Center in Willowbrook, Illinois. Sheikh Tariq is a coffee fanatic and loves to chill at Starbucks and hang out with people. He's also been hit in the face by a pie more than once by his congregation. Welcome, Sheikh Tariq. I promise we won't hit you with a pie tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's very reassuring.
Next, we have Pastor Tony Thomas. Pastor Tony graduated with a Bachelor's of Chemical Engineering from the Illinois Institute of Technology and worked in industry for about 5 years as he completed his Master of Divinity from Columbia International University. Pastor Tony Thomas is an ordained minister and teaching elder of the Presbyterian Church in America. He currently serves young adults and young families at Perimeter Church in Johns Creek, Georgia. He also plays a role in working to equip and bless the South Asian community. He also loves the Chicago Bulls and thinks that MJ is the GOAT, which I agree with. And he wanted to go pro, but unfortunately he was cut from his basketball team freshman year. So he became a pastor instead. So thank you for giving up your basketball dreams and joining us today, Pastor Tony.
Cool. Thank you, Arthi, for the introduction. Glad to be here for this discussion.
And finally, last but not least, we have Brahmacharni Sweta Chaitanya. Sweta's Vedanta journey began when she began attending children's classes at Chinmaya Mission in Houston during her childhood. After completing her undergraduate degree in Sanskrit at the University of Texas in Austin, inspiration from the Vedanta teachings of Chinmaya Mission paired with her Sanskrit studies led her to this 2-year residential Vedanta course at Sandipani Sadhanalaya, Mumbai in August of 2014. After being trained in great depth by Swami Bodhatmadanda for 2 years, she returned to Columbia University in New York to finish her master's. In August of 2017, she was initiated into the monastic order as Brahmacharni Shweta. Hosted now in Houston, Brahmacharni Shweta shares the message of Advaita Vedanta through discourses offered at Chinmaya Mission Houston and through study groups across the greater Houston area. This past year, Brahmacharni attended Harvard Divinity School under the Nagral Fellowship, a fellowship uniquely dedicated to fostering collaborative discussion between Hindu monastics and scholars of Hinduism. Thank you for joining us, Brahmacharya.
Thank you, Arti, for that intro. And I wish I had some fun facts, but I can only hope that one day I'll also get a pie thrown in my face so we can share that later. But I look forward to the discussion.
All right, so quickly before we begin, I wanted to go over some of the ground rules and general outline for tonight. So for an outline, we're going to start with an explanation of the core tenets of faith for each of our panelists. Then we're going to have questions pertaining to race and injustice, and we'll finish with an open question and answer session. We're aiming to keep this within an hour and a half. And then for rules for panelists, each panelist has an allotted time per question. When there's 1 minute left, I'll put up this yellow card, and when their time is up, I'll hold up the red card. And rules for the audience. So as you guys will notice, the chat has been disabled. However, the Q&A is active and it'll remain active for the rest of the night. So please feel free to send in any questions that you think of throughout the entire event, and we will ask the questions later during the Q&A portion. All right, so without further ado, let's begin the evening. So first, we'd like each of our panelists to explain the core tenets of their faith, basically an explanation of what they believe in. So Brahmacharya Sweta, we'll start with you.
Sure. I belong to a branch of Hinduism called Advait Vedanta. The main sort of concern of Advait Vedanta is with a concept called moksha, or freedom from sorrow. And the conception of this freedom from sorrow is right here, right now in this world. And so the key to this, the key to finding this within the Advaita tradition is found within the Upanishads, the set of texts called the Upanishads. And in the Upanishads, specifically statements that reveal the nature of one's own self, as well as the world around, that reveal the oneness between those two, or the non-duality between those two. And so such kind of statements are considered to be sort of the principal tenets of what Advait Vedanta sort of holds dear. And, you know, naturally then, if one has to think about what bondage is then, you know, what is it that one wants liberation from, given this sort of framework, then the Vedantin would simply ask a person to look at, you know, their own life and their own conception of self, and to just see whether what that looks like. And for the most part, the Vedantin is sort of invited to think about how our conception of self seems to be tied to an identification with other things, with things that are somewhat limited. So in the sense that we tend to think of ourselves as a body or a mind or an intellect, and that sort of extends into other ideas of division, like me versus them, or my ideas, their ideas, us, them. This sort of divisive understanding of the self is what Vedanta then sort of thinks of as bondage, or what one would want to seek freedom from. And why this seems to be an issue for an Advait Vedantin is because the thought then occurs that when things are conducive to me, given my, you know, whatever conception of myself is, when things are conducive, then things are okay. But when things are not conducive to me, then things are not okay. And so for an Advait Vedantin, this seems to be an inescapable problem then, if the identification is limited to just these sort of divisions. And so now, you know, we can turn to a Mahavakya, which is given in the Chandogya Upanishad, that not only sort of describes the overall, this principle of non-duality, but also kind of prescribes a practice as to how one can try to achieve that goal, if that's what they so seek. And the statement given in the Upanishad is Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art, you are that. And essentially, it is again pointing out the non-dual nature between oneself and the world around them. And why I say this is also prescriptive in a sense is because devotion is then brought in within this statement. So the self or that Brahman or that existence consciousness expressing through the individual is what is called as you or Dwam. The self expressing through totality is what is called as Ishwar or God. And so developing a relationship between the two is what this statement sort of invites a seeker to start to develop. And this Vedantic sort of worship of God is meant to help one recognize that non-dual self, not just within their own individual self, but in the world around as well. And I think this is a beautiful thing because what happens, or what is said to happen, is that a transformation sort of takes place within one's understanding of themselves. And by extension, their understanding of care and engagement with the world around, because that self is no longer limited to what the identification of individuality was, but it's now expanded to the world around. And so there becomes an increased sort of sensitivity to the world around, an increased engagement with the world around, an increased compassion for the world around. And so this is supposed to then, culminate into the final sort of understanding of I am that non-dual reality. And from that point, then spontaneously, we can see through the qualities that are described as someone who understands this truth. We can see that a person who understands this then spontaneously lives a life of peace and of compassion. And again, I want to highlight sensitivity towards others' pain and sorrow, and also joy. So in a nutshell, I'm looking down a lot because I wrote down some points and I wanted to make sure I covered them, which I didn't cover everything, but that's okay. But in a nutshell, that's sort of the Advaita Vedanta vision.
Thank you, Brahmachari Sweta. Next, we'll go to Pastor Thomas.
All right, thanks, Arti. Yeah, so I think in terms of the faith, let's just begin by saying, the Christian faith is based on what we see in the Bible. My Bible here, we believe is the Word of God. And, the Bible is a pretty long book, and so it can seem complicated, but I think we can see it actually is a unified story, though it's written over generations and centuries, actually. It can be kind of told in like 4 acts. So I'll try to make it simple that way by saying there's 4 acts to the story of Christianity, the story of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. So I'll try to share it in those ways. First act is creation, that God created us, created human beings in his image. He created us perfectly. And he began with Adam and Eve, the first human beings. And so even to relate it to the topic of race, that we as human beings, Christians believe that the human race is a unified race, that we are ultimately from the same ancestry. And so in terms of we had a perfect relationship with God. So vertically, we had a perfect relationship with God. We also horizontally had perfect relationship with each other. And so that's the state of creation. But the next act in the story is the fall, which is where Adam and Eve had fallen into sin. God had given him his law, which was good. His good law meant for their protection, meant for their blessing. And yet they chose to disbelieve and to rebel against God and his law. And so they and the result of that falling into sin for humanity was that there was a broken relationship then with us and God vertically, and a broken resulted horizontally, that there was division amongst people. And even again, as we talk about the issue of racism, its roots are found in the fall. Racism, if you think about it, it's a type of preferential treatment of people, that I prefer like my own people as opposed to another person, because it's rooted in selfishness. It's rooted in self-interest, which comes from the fall of humanity. So in some sense, we all have the roots of racism in us, even if we may not manifest its roots or its fruits in our lives all the time. So that was a result of the fall. Now, logically speaking, it could be almost assumed that the Bible should be a 3-act story. There should be creation, fall, and then judgment. Because what we see in the Bible is that God is holy. And God hates sin, and a just response to the sin of humanity is that he would pour out his wrath, his punishment. And we kind of know this innately. Like if we recognize there's a murderer in a courtroom, and that murderer was on trial, we would recognize that that murderer should face justice for what the wrong that they'd done. In the same way, God, be just, is to be good, and he would have to punish sin, humanity for our sin. But what we see is that the story doesn't end with judgment. The story continues because God not only is just, but God is loving. And that's the great truth of the Bible. Yet the question is, how does God reconcile those two things? Because he is just and he's loving. How is he going to reconcile his justice and his love? And that leads to the third act in the story of Christianity, which is the story of redemption. The answer of how God would resolve the tension of justice and love is found in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus is God himself who came and took on human flesh. He was God-man. And in his human nature, he had this perfect love for God the Father, and he had a perfect love for humanity. If you read through what we call the Gospels, the stories of Jesus in his life, it's just this unbelievable image of what humanity was always meant to be. He is better than Adam was. He's better than any of us was. But here's the key truth that's unique in Christianity, is that Jesus is an example, but he's not only an example to follow. And if that's all that he was, that humanity would be left in our sin. But the key to understanding Christianity is actually the cross of Jesus Christ. Jesus was sentenced to crucifixion. And it wasn't just by what was done by human beings, but it was ultimately the divine plan of God. That God through the cross was going to reconcile his justice and his love. Again, justice would be that the just punishment for sin was going to be paid for, but it was going to be paid for by Christ on the cross. And then his love would be reconciled because he's saying, instead of humanity dying for their sin, I'm going to have Jesus himself is going to die and take our place. He's going to be our substitute. But the story doesn't end at the cross. He resurrects from the grave 3 days later to show that he's overcome sin. He's conquered it on our behalf. And that leads then to the last act, which is consummation. That Christians, as we understand this gospel, this good news, that we place our faith in Jesus. We trust in him wholly. There's a line from a song that says, "Nothing in my hands I bring, simply to your cross I cling." We just simply cling to the cross, and we are vertically reconciled to God. We have a new heart that's like Jesus, that enables us to now horizontally love others as Christ has loved us, which is then the power to fight racism, to fight it in us, to fight it in others. But I think the greatest love a Christian can have is actually a love for humanity, which would be to make this good news known, that all of humanity has fallen into sin, every ethnicity, and one day Christ is going to come again to judge. So the great way we can love is to warn that judgment is coming, but not only warn, but encourage to say that you can find forgiveness, you can find peace, you can find joy and true life in Christ by just trusting in him. And so that's the hope that I have, and I think Christians have, is that to allow people to hear the offer of forgiveness and a hope of eternity through Jesus.
Thank you, Pastor Tony. And last but not least, Sheikh Tark.
I want to begin by thanking Pastor Tony and Shweta for this discussion. I always, obviously you as well, Arti, but the opportunity to learn from you and get insight into other faiths and other ways of life is always so inspirational to me. In terms of the fundamental faiths of Islam, of the Muslim faith, at the core of it really is this faith in God. Obviously, we refer to it often as creed or theology, but this understanding of having faith in God, knowing who God is, and recognizing that by understanding and discovering God, we actually end up discovering ourselves and our purpose on this earth. And talking about our understanding of God in Islam, we do believe that my God and your God, that there is only one God. This fundamental part of Islam is such that we believe in the one true God being Allah. And one of the most merciful things that God did is God informed us of himself. So he shared his names and his attributes. And part of what we believe in is that Allah, or God, is the all merciful, meaning every amount of mercy that exists between us is sourced in him. That God is the source of all peace that every element of peace that exists on this earth is from him and belongs to him, that God is the most generous, that every act of kindness and generosity that exists between us is gifted to us from him. Even the love of a mother for her child, even the love of a Bulls fan for a Lakers fan, even the love of people that might share nothing but the same Popeye's chicken sandwich, all of this love that we share, the most minute and trivial to the most magnificent of love that we share, this is rooted in the fact that God is the source of all love and mercy and kindness. And I can just go on for the next 10 minutes talking about how amazing it is to know who God is, because then we know who to strive to be. If God is loving, I should be loving unconditionally. If God is generous, then I should try to be generous as well. If God is merciful and forgiving, then I too should be forgiving. So then by discovering God, we cling to him, right? Like Pastor Tony said, but we also try to embody those characteristics of God, recognizing that they are in their complete perfection only to him. A big part of our faith as well is our belief in the prophets, Prophet Adam, Prophet Moses, Prophet Noah, Prophet Jesus, and all of the prophets. We actually believe that there is not a single nook and cranny of the globe except that there was a prophet sent to that place. And we're all calling to the same faith and belief in God. And so the final prophet, and actually it's like bricks to a building, the final prophet and the final brick to this building was the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon all of the prophets of God. And so he came with this universal message for all of humanity, this way of life, if you will. So we have this theology, that we have this belief and faith, and then we have what is referred to as Sharia, this boogeyman word, Sharia. Sharia is it literally means a spring of water, because everything that the Sharia touches, it gives life. So the Sharia tells me how to be with my wife and how my wife is to be with me, how I better be a good son to my parents and how my parents ought to raise me, how I should be towards the environment, how I should be towards animals, how I should be in terms of standing for human rights and justice and freedom. That is truly what Sharia is. It's the way of life. So that is, and the source of Sharia law, if you will, or the doctrine that we live by, is the book of God, which is the Quran. And we do believe in the fact that there are other books of faith, such as the Bible and the Testament. And so the final book, just like the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the final prophet, having completed the message. We also believe in the Quran being the final revelation of God. And what's beautiful about the words of God is that I will say something today and my words will expire. It'll be like Tariq said a lame joke in 2020 on July 5th, and that'll be khalas, like that's it, that's put on the side, right? But God is not limited to time. God is not limited to time. So his words also are not limited. So God said and is saying and will continue to say. Like, how amazing is that? So the words of the Quran and the words of scripture are words that do not expire. So every time I read the words of God, there is something for me to take from the words of God. Real quick, we also believe in the angels, Angel Gabriel, Michael, and so many other angels that we believe in. We believe that there's an angel on the right shoulder and the left shoulder recording our deeds, obviously not as depicted by perhaps Hollywood and the cartoons, but nonetheless, that there are constantly angels surrounding us, going back to God and reporting the good that is being done. And of course, he is the all-knowing. And again, these are just some exposures to that. Obviously, a big part of our faith is we do pray consistently. We have 5 prayers. And so these 5 prayers are kind of like the recharging of our souls. Every single day when we stand in prayer, if we're capable, physically capable of standing, and sitting if we're not, and laying if we have to, we pray 5 times a day. It's a renewal of purpose, if you will, a renewal of guide us to the straight path, the path of those whom you love. Who are those people? They are the prophets, the messengers, the saints, the likes of Mary and Jesus and Moses and Adam and Aaron and so many other figures of our history, the companions of the prophet. We're saying, God, guide us to the straight path, the path of those people whom you love, and that is a renewal that we do 5 times a day. There's more to be said, but we'll keep it at that for now.
Thank you, Sheikh Tariq. So jumping into the topic at hand, the next question is, what do your holy books and teachings say about race and injustice? So since we started with Brahmacharya last time, we'll go the other way this time. So Sheikh Tariq, we'll start with you.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I apologize.
No problem. So what do your holy books and teachings say about race and injustice?
So really, Pastor Tony kind of touched on this a little bit. We believe that if you look back in time, the very first sin was actually a type of racism, almost, if you will, or a type of prejudice. Because when God created Adam, what happened was God commanded all of the angels to prostrate to Adam. And when God commanded all the angels to prostrate to Adam, Iblis or Satan refused to prostrate to Adam. And when asked, why will you not prostrate to him? Iblis's response, or Satan's response, was, I am better than him. You created me from fire and you created him from clay. And if you hear the words, I am better than him, that superiority complex, that thought of being better than someone simply because of what they look like or what they're made out of, that is the actual textbook definition of what prejudice and racism are. It's this belief of being innately better than someone else. And so we actually view that to be the most original of sins or mistakes in the history of humanity. It's when Satan decided that he was better than Adam, and he rejected and refused God's command to prostrate, a reverential prostration to Prophet Adam at that time of his creation. So what this tells us is, close to what Pastor Tony was saying, is that there is a continuous perhaps inclination that we need to fight, this human disease that we may have to feel the need to incline towards superiority, but that is the opposite of what we are supposed to do. And so what we're called to by God at that moment is to actually see the goodness in the other person, to respect and love what exists within them. I want to take a moment to step into the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. The Prophet Muhammad came at a time where there was a lot of hate and racism and division and bigotry in the Arabian Peninsula at the time. And so one of the fundamental things that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, did is that he combated that. When he stood on the mountain and he gathered his people, one of the very first things that he did is he said that a black is not superior to a white, and a white is not superior to a black. And he said that, the only thing that ranks a person at a greater level than the other is their piety and their righteousness, and their nearness to God and their service to humanity, and that God is the ultimate judge of that. There's a beautiful statement of the Prophet Muhammad, where he says that God does not look at your physical self, right? God does not look at what you look externally. God doesn't care that I'm already balding and I'm not even 30 yet. Those are not the things that concern God, right? The things that, what does God actually look at? But rather he looks at your hearts and your actions. What do you do with yourself? That is the way, when we talk about the currencies of God or the scales of God, we have to be able to embrace the reality that as much as we judge things off of face value, that is the opposite of what God looks at. God looks at the state of the heart, and God looks at the state of our actions. So the Prophet Muhammad came at a time when one of the most pressing needs of humanity was to remove this illness of racism and bigotry and prejudice that existed, and he combated it. And so actually some of the first followers of the Prophet Muhammad were people that were owned as slaves, and the Prophet would free them from slavery, and he would then empower them, liberate them, and actually encourage them to be the leaders of their people. So this is just a little bit of the background, and we'll talk more about how Islam went about to combat racism in a little bit.
Thank you, Sheikh Tariq. So we'll go to Pastor Tony now.
All right. I'll just start by saying, Sheikh Dark, I'm going bald too, but you have at least
You're doing a better job hiding it.
that's the key. You gotta hide it, but you got that beautiful brown hair though, so you one up in me. Anyway, in terms of so there's two things here, right? It talks about race and injustice. So I'll kind of break it into two parts. Talk about race. What is a Christian message? Talk about race, and I think I'll use this phrase unity and diversity. I think the first thing we mentioned about humanity in the Bible is that there's an essential unity. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but we're all made in the image of God. We were descended from Adam and Eve, so we have a common ancestry. So though there's a diversity of races, we all look different across the world, but in our essence, we're really the same humanity. And so there's a unity that we have to recognize that kind of cuts at the heart of racism that tries to call us different. So we're united in our humanity. I mean, some other things we're united in too is our sinfulness, that we all sin and fall short of God's glorious standard, but we also are united in that the message of the gospel that Jesus Christ came for anybody, any ethnicity can come and turn to him in faith. So there's an essential unity, but there's a second part to that, which holds it in tension, is that there's a celebrated diversity. Our unity does not remove our differences. There's this beautiful picture in the end of the Bible. There's a vision of what heaven will look like. It says that there's going to be people from every nation, tribe, language, and tongue worshiping Christ. So there's going to be people there. If you can think of the image there, it's saying that there's going to be people that are Indian and Pakistani and Chinese, Japanese, Saudi Arabian, Kenyan, French, Brazilian, white, black. We're not going to put our differences at the door of heaven, but we're going to bring them into heaven. And we're going to worship God in the uniqueness of our differences and celebrate Christ through those differences, that he is more beautiful and glorified because we're different, not because we're all the same. And I think Christianity keeps those two things in tension, that our essential unity and our celebrated diversity. That's about race, but I'd say in terms of injustice, I talked about kind of the vertical part and the horizontal. It's kind of picture symbolic in the cross, right? The cross vertically reconciles us to God, and the other beam of the cross reconciles us to one another. The way I like to talk about injustice is actually, if I could allude to the movie Lion King. I don't know if, hopefully everyone's seen it. It's kind of old. I'm going to give away the ending, so hopefully it's okay. But, Simba leaves, right? He's the rightful king, but Scar takes over. He's the evil uncle king who really rule well. And when he's ruling, all the animals are struggling. There's hunger, there's fighting, there's pain, there's suffering. But when Simba, the rightful king, returns, there's a just rule, flourishing that happens for all the other animals. And that's the picture of justice. Justice is not just the punishment of wrong, but it's the fighting for the ultimate flourishing of humanity. And one of the things that destroys flourishing is racism and any sorts of injustice. And so as Christians, we seek the flourishing of humanity. We believe that the reign of Jesus, his righteous law brings the greatest good. And so that means we fight injustice in these ways. We fight it in our own hearts. When I see the sin of preferential treatment or racism, I fight it in my own heart. When I see it existing in society, we're willing to call it out. And we stand for the oppressed as well. We recognize that there's systems of power that can cause oppression for groups of people. And so we call out systems of injustice as well too. And so we long for the righteous reign that brings most blessing to most people. And so that's part of how Christians look at the issue of justice.
Thank you, Pastor Tony. Last but not least, from Attorney Shweta.
Yeah, so I'll start with as far as what the teachings in Advaita Vedanta have to say to race and injustice. If we look at the core texts of Advaita Vedanta, the Upanishads, the way that they're written and the way that they're, or I guess the proper word would be revealed, would be that they are rather philosophizing in nature. And so a lot of what's dealt with are things like, what is subjectivity, what is experience, and of course within its own framework and context. What is God? Is there God? Is there not God? Like these sort of things are talked about. And again, if one were to read these things with an Advaita sort of view, then what stands out as the final purport here is that all are essentially one in nature, or essentially that Brahman, that existence, consciousness, bliss in nature. And so the active sort of recognition of that, the practice of it, and then the spontaneous sort of recognition of that is the whole Vedantic journey. And that, and again, as far as how Brahman, or that existence consciousness, expresses in ourselves and the entire world around, and to that I would say the entire creation around within the Advaita framework, is that Brahman expresses equally the same within everyone. And so again, as I said, within the Upanishads, these sort of things are laid out, and in those same Upanishads, you'll find descriptions of those who have understood this, or who live by this. And their descriptions are always written as those who are filled with compassion, those who are the very embodiments of peace, and those who, again, as I say, are sensitive to sorrow, because I think the first sort of impulse one has within the Advaita framework to even seek out this sort of thing is a certain sensitivity to sorrow. And so the moment within the Advaita framework, the moment someone starts this journey of tending to one's own sorrow, and then, as I said before, then tending to it on, outside of oneself, in this effort of trying to recognize the self in others, then all of a sudden, at least to me, it strikes me that a seeker and a realized person within this framework would always be sensitive to sorrow in any way, shape, or form, and would always be willing to extend a hand and to extend their minds, their hearts, and their efforts towards eliminating that sorrow, towards tending to that sorrow. I think there's maybe a little, in this tradition, sorrow is a big thing. It's, and we sometimes get desensitized to that word within the tradition, but it is a big thing. It's the very foundational sort of impulse that one has to sort of seek out something like this oneness within all. And so the reason why I wanted to preface, what's written in these texts and what the description of this person who understands something like Brahman or existence consciousness, what that person looks like, is because then it becomes the task of the seeker to discern a path of living in accordance with those insights. And to then realize also that the field of practice for this is different from the field of practice for a commentator, let's say, who lived 100 years ago, then who lived 200 years ago, then who lived like in the 8th century. And so the field of practice is always changing, but this idea of being sensitive to sorrow, being sensitive to, and I bring up sorrow because it is the, once we're sensitive to that, then immediately one will be sensitive to racial injustice, will be sensitive to any sort of injustice for that matter. And not only because that's the sort of framework within which one is working with, the impulse that one is following, but because that's the sort of end goal as well, to see oneness within all, to recognize that oneness within all. Because that's the case, and because it's more of like this expansion of self, that all of a sudden care and compassion, as I mentioned, become sort of the guiding lights for a seeker of this kind of moksha. And so yeah, so this this is one part of it as far as the teachings are concerned, and as far as understanding these teachings within a modern context are concerned. But I will say that, I mean, it has to be, someone who is embarking on this journey has to be fully aware that these Upanishadic texts are also situated within the larger sort of Vedic corpus. And within that Vedic corpus, there are other things mentioned that find their mention, like caste and patriarchy. These sort of things are also there. And so I think for someone who's embarking on this vision of oneness, but also knows that these texts are situated within the sort of larger set of texts or set of ideas that include these things that are in stark contradiction to what the seeker is trying to seek out. I think it becomes important then to pay close attention to the text, tradition, and also the history that is tied to these, tied to this pursuit for liberation, within the Advaita context. And so being able to grapple with all of these things, and incorporating all of that into one's own understanding of what oneness means today, not just today, but also in light of what happened in the past. I think these are all very, very important considerations for any seeker on this path. And I'm purposely not sort of expanding on these ideas of caste and patriarchy, because I think we have another question on this, so I'll bring it up. I'll bring it up there. I'll just add one more thing before, if I have time. I think one of the key things to remember within the Hindu context, or at least within this Advaita context, is that the tradition, because as I said, it's up to the seeker to sort of discern a path of living in accordance with these sort of insights that are given in the text, is to realize that the commentarial tradition of building off of one another. So sort of someone writes something and then later someone agrees, but then also disagrees with something else. And then someone else later would agree and disagree with something else. A fourth person later would just totally disagree with everything and write someone else. Everything is fair game within the current sort of person's task of figuring out how they're going to inculcate these sort of principles, these overlying principles of Vedanta. And so I feel it is actually a very sort of Hindu thing to take up that task even now, this task of interpretation, this task of figuring out in this context today, what do these things mean? And if that means that something contradicts something in practice, again, I'm making that distinction between practice and principle, but in practice, if that means that something contradicts, something that was said before, then in fact, nothing is really at stake. It's perhaps like the most Hindu thing you can do to explore that. So anyways, I think that sort of fearlessness with grappling with one's own inherited sort of history, with their tradition, grappling with the principles within the tradition, and grappling with the traditional sort of commentary on those texts that you're kind of that are revealing these insights. All three of those things are extremely important to then addressing something like race and injustice.
Thank you, Brahmacharya Shweta. Before we jump into the next question, just a reminder for everybody at home, keep the questions coming. I'm seeing all of them, so keep them coming and we'll ask them at the end during the Q&A. So next question is, based on historical examples of racial segregation, sectarian violence, and class division caused in the name of religious beliefs, how do you respond to someone who says that your faith has been a greater part of the race and injustice problem rather than the solution? So we'll start with Pastor Tony on this one, and then we'll snake around.
Well, it's a good question, tough question. But I think I'll start with this, that as Christians, I think we believe part of our ethic, in a sense, we believe in transparency and just honest confession, and so I just say on behalf of other Christians today and even in history, that we as Christians have failed many times. We've wrongly used our faith to pervert justice, to perpetuate injustice. I'll just share a couple. There could be many that we can point to, but one that I think we think of in history is, the church sanctioned the Crusades, a war against Muslims, to take back the Holy Land about 1,000 years ago. And, I could, even with Sheikh Tariq here as a Muslim, as a Christ follower, I would confess and ask for forgiveness on behalf of the church for that injustice that was perpetuated. That as Christians, we don't believe our inheritance is tied to a land anymore. Our inheritance is in Christ and in heaven ultimately. And so we should be willing to forfeit lands and give up possessions for the sake of love, and I think that was a sin, that we justified using various texts, I think wrongly. Another one and relevant one for us is American slavery, racism against Blacks. Many of the slave owners were not necessarily all Christians, but many were. And there were false arguments made on the basis of the Bible that somehow Blacks were inferior people to white, and that there was a divine right that was given to them to enslave them into forced labor. And that's a sad stain on the church of Christ in America. And many times the church actually preached to defend that, or at the very least stayed silent in the midst of that injustice. And so again, especially in light of our current context, I think on behalf of the church and Christians, would repent and ask for forgiveness to the Black community, because we're guilty for that. And so I'd say the first answer to that is we've done wrong. Christians have done wrong many times. We've created injustice instead of stopping injustice. But in the midst of saying that, I'd say this is that in terms of Christianity, I think, and this goes for almost everybody, I'd say that we should ultimately judge the merits of Christianity not based on the actions of Christians, but on the actual person of Christ. A person's faith is not really based upon how well the followers live it out, but how true it just is in its essence. And when we look at Jesus himself, and what the Bible teaches, like all those things that I said were not the interpretations of the Bible that are true. They're misinterpretations and misapplications of the scripture itself. But I think when Christianity is rightly believed and rightly applied, it would bring to the greatest peace and flourishing and justice to the world. And so I just say that we can't gloss over the mistakes that Christians have made. We've made great mistakes, and we repent, and we're trying by God's grace to overcome those and to be the people that Christ called us to be.
Thank you, Pastor Tony. So we'll go to Brahmacharya Shweta now about how your faith has been a part of the race and injustice debate.
Sure. I just want to say, Pastor Tony, I really appreciated what you just shared. I think I absolutely agree with that idea that if we are to take our faith seriously, then we should take the faith seriously, and not take what people practice necessarily, or what comes out of a particular practice, as a sort of signifier of what the entire faith represents. And so I really appreciated that. I think from the Hindu perspective, what I want to bring up here are what I think are two of the biggest sort of perpetrators of injustice that have happened in the name of Hinduism. And those two things here are what I mentioned before, sort of caste injustice and patriarchy, and through that, gender inequality. And here, again, as I said, these things find their mention within the textual sort of corpus. And so on the one hand, I think it's not proper to say that these things don't exist, because today we have come out with an interpretation that is gone beyond such a thing. And at the same time, I also don't think, of course, it's right to stick to a dogmatic reading of these sort of things. And so the reason why I say that is because it seems that if one considers themselves to be an Advait Vedantin, sensitive to sorrow, sensitive to what's called dukkham, then having open ears and having an open heart and having an open mind are something that would be sort of natural to a seeker and to someone who, let's say, is realized in this tradition. And the thing that comes with that is, if one is open in that sort of way, then there would be no problem in admitting to harm and working to correct any harm that has been committed by that person. There wouldn't be, again, anything at stake. It wouldn't be an impossible task. It would, in fact, I feel, be a very obvious one, that if harm is committed by somebody, then that harm should be owned up to and should be addressed and corrected. And I want to bring up first the example here of women within the monastic community, for example. So within the monastic community, within Vedanta, Swami Chinmayananda was one of the first people to initiate women into the monastic order. And prior to him, Swami Vivekananda had done this. He sort of set the precedent for this. But it should be noted that this is a stark sort of departure from the tradition. This is a sort of response to a tradition where it wasn't possible for women to do this sort of thing. And because this sort of departure has happened, and in response to this limitation that was put on women, I think one of the main things that needs to happen is more dialogue then. More spaces for women to be able to sort of describe, highlight, explain their own conception of entering this sort of space, what it means for them to take on monastic robes, what it means for them to enter a male space, and what's happening not just within the woman, but within the tradition itself. So I think these are really important dialogues that aren't to be, that shouldn't happen, at one time, but these are continuous dialogues, right? Because the moment this departure happened, it's like a seed was planted and it has to now be actualized. And so the worst thing that I think, or the last thing that should happen, is when these sort of discussions are happening, for there to be a damper put on them, or for those voices to be muffled. And I think, in many ways, dialogue is important because it's a testament to the fact that our society changes and we're constantly evolving. And on this point, I don't think apologia or polemics is the way to go here. I really feel that in many ways those kind of things prevent dialogue instead of enabling it. And I think this has been the case for caste for many, many, many years, and it is still the case now. I think when it comes to caste inequality, these sort of things should be talked about. They should be acknowledged, and there should be this open understanding of correcting any wrongs that may have been done. And again, this is to say that in fact this would be a very Hindu thing to do, is to grapple with the past, to own up to the past, to own up to harm that has been done, and to learn or to collaborate with others on how to move forward.
Thank you, Brahmacharya Shweta. And now we'll go to Sheikh Tarek.
Thank you so much. I wanna begin by just echoing the sentiments of Shweta and Pastor Tony. It takes courage. It takes courage to be able, for us as a people of faith, to kind of walk that fine line of taking ownership of when people who are affiliated or affiliate themselves with our faith do things in the name of our faith. As a person, who was 8 years old when 9/11 happened, and had to go through, just going to the regular store with my mom, who's a hijab-wearing woman, and hearing her getting yelled at for something that had absolutely nothing to do with her in the name of our faith. I can confidently tell you that I was not 8 years old. I think I wish I was 8 years old when that happened, but I was pretty young. But the point remains that this idea of recognizing that there are people that do terrible things in the name of faith, and to learn our faiths through their actual beliefs and concepts, and not because of the history that might exist. Although the people of faith must take ownership of the conversation, similar to what our Honorable Shweta was saying about really having those necessary dialogues. What type of misunderstandings are leading to such actions taking place, and what preventative measures can be taken where faith is used in the way that it was meant to be used. The purpose of faith is to enhance and better the state of humanity. And so when faith is used to do the exact opposite of that, it's extremely problematic. And because faith is such a powerful tool, equal to the good that it can do, people can use it to do harm. And so recognizing that within all faith communities, there's this responsibility to take proactive, preventative measures to educate ourselves and our congregations about what it means to misuse and misinterpret the religion and our systems of faith, and to own up to the things that have been done. And rather than just reconciling them and perhaps creating false narratives of them, taking ownership of what it means to go back and not rewrite history, but to correct those mistakes to the best of our ability, and to ask, with all honesty, for God's forgiveness, and to ask those communities that have been negatively impacted what we can do to best serve them and better their circumstances. And this is something that we find to be, again, the examples of the prophets. This is what we find the Prophet Muhammad doing when two tribes were fighting with one another over just, matters that had, absolute no significance. We find him coming and creating that unity between them, similar to the idea that Pastor Tony had mentioned earlier of there being this united front, this united family, that this coming together as humanity, and then at the same time bringing in what Shweta was talking about this idea of recognizing each other's sorrow, understanding that pain that we've been through, feeling it, maybe creating the sense of empathy and sympathy for one another, and using that to kind of move forward and becoming just one body of united goodness. And so I think that taking that ownership and connecting and recognizing where faults have been done, while at the same time recognizing that while that may have been done in the name of faith, that our faiths are free of any really affiliation, and it becomes the responsibility of each and every single one of us, the 104 people that are on this. It takes our responsibility to say no. As much as there are people that are doing things incorrectly in the name of my faith, I will proactively go out there and show them what my faith teaches in terms of fighting for justice, in terms of standing for freedom, in terms of, women's rights, in terms of making sure that voices, irrespective of who they're coming from, irrespective of the affiliated faith, irrespective of the orientation, that every voice is to be heard, that every drop of blood is sacred, that every soul is honored, and that, the Muslims, when we pray 5 times a day, we face the Kaaba. And it's a holy house in Mecca. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and when you go there, there are typically, outside of obviously the current situation of COVID that we're in, there are millions of people there. There are millions of people that flee there, that go there from across the world, to go there to worship God. It's where we believe Abraham built the first house of worship, and so on and so forth. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, said this about the most holy place on earth for Muslims. He said that God would rather see that most holy of houses broken down rock by rock, brick by brick. He would rather see that than for one human soul to be hurt and mistreated. That is the sanctity of life. God does not discriminate. God only loves and cares and provides. And so we have an obligation to stand by our Black brothers and sisters, and people of color of all backgrounds who've dealt with systemic oppression. It is our human responsibility and each of our faith responsibilities to stand by them, to advocate for them. And it is our faith responsibility to not only be their ally, but to also go ahead and voice our concern and our support for them and everything that they need.
Thank you, Sheikh Tariq. I know that was a pretty pointed question, but I think all of you guys answered beautifully and definitely acknowledged how each of your faiths has played a role in this problem in the past. Reminder, keep the questions coming. I do see all of them. This is going to be our last question of the main questions that we have to ask before moving into the Q&A portion. So for this question, as a religious leader, how would you say an individual of your faith should respond to the perpetrator of such injustices based on your beliefs? And we'll start with Pastor Tony on this one.
I think one of the best ways to talk through this is to point to a teaching of Jesus that he gave. In one of his teachings, he started by saying, judge not lest you be judged. And he went on to give this illustration, and the illustration is this. He says, imagine you see like a speck of dust in your brother's eye, and you say that you're going to remove it. And Jesus says, but recognize the plank in your own eye. So there's like a giant log in your own eye. It says, remove that first so that then you can see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And I think there's different principles then of how we deal with sin in ourselves and other people that Jesus is teaching us there. The first idea is that as Christians, we always approach the sins of others with humility, recognizing that we are first and foremost are sinners. That we may not be committing the same exact sin that they're doing, And sometimes we're even the ones being sinned against by that person, but we never approach people with an attitude or air of self-righteousness or condemnation, because we recognize that I'm a sinner that's been forgiven by the grace of God. And so we always have that humility to say, I have a plank and my brother's got a speck. So that's the first approach, is approach of humility. But at the same time, Jesus is saying, don't neglect the speck. It's in your brother's eye. Like, if your brother's got a speck, do the good work of helping that brother get that speck out of his eye. You approach them in humility, but then it's a loving thing. And if it's the sin of racism, it's a loving thing to point out that you have the sin of racism in your eye, because that's harming that person and it's harming other people. And it would be unloving to ignore it, to just go. And so we have to confront sins in other people. So if there's a perpetrator of injustice, we approach them with humility, but then we also confront the injustice. But then I think the last thing we would say as a Christian is that any injustice that's committed, even the sin of racism, there's no unforgivable sin. To make it even more tangible, again, with the news, there's the police officer Chauvin, right, who killed George Floyd. I think what we can see very clearly that what he did was wrong. I don't know if in his heart, was it driven by racism exactly in his heart? I don't know exactly, can't see into his heart, but what he did was definitely wrong. And yet, even if it was, let's say it was driven by racism, I think as a Christian, if I had the chance to speak to Derek Chauvin, I would tell him, in humility, that what you did was wrong, it was reprehensible. We can't bring back this man's life. It's been taken away from him. It's been taken away from his family. But I would say to him, Derek Chauvin, I'm a sinner too. I failed in so many ways, and yet though I'm a great sinner, I have a great Savior in Jesus, who forgives all of my sins. And so no matter how great the failure is that it was in your life, that there's a Savior, Jesus, who can forgive even this sin, and he can change your heart by his grace. And I think that's the full message that we give to perpetrators of injustice. We don't shy away from, we don't treat them with self-righteousness. We don't shy away from confronting their sin, but we also give the good offer of forgiveness that comes through Christ. And so that's, I think, the full way that we would deal with perpetrators of injustice.
Thank you, Pastor Tony. We'll go to Sheikh Dart next.
I think that was absolutely beautiful. I think overall I would say our responsibility is to hate the sin and not the sinner. It's understanding that, standing unapologetically and unequivocally against any form of injustice and any form of racism or prejudice doesn't necessitate for us to become that ourselves. A lot of times, and this is a kind of a heavy statement to make, a lot of times we might become the very monster that we're trying to fight. And so recognizing that there is an obligation for us to remain humble, to remain, cool-minded, to remain, avoiding of things such as what was alluded to of self-righteousness and this belief of being better than the other is something very, very critical. Recognizing that most times people are hurting others because they are hurt themselves. Hurt people. And so recognizing that they are in need of God, they are in need of faith, they're in need of human love. And that doesn't by any means remove the need for justice. The need for love does not stop the need for justice, but it means that in the process of seeking justice, we hold ourselves to a standard of ethics and morals and values that doesn't allow us to commit injustice to those who have been unjust themselves. So I think walking that fine line, there's a story in our faith about a man who killed 99 people. So he went to a leader and he said, listen, I've killed 99 people. He just went to a man of faith and he said, hey, if I kill 99 people, is it possible for God to forgive me? And the man said, no, God is not going to forgive somebody who killed 99 people. And so he went ahead and he killed him, and now he's killed 100 people. And then he found another faith leader, someone who was a little bit more learned. And he said, can God forgive me even though I've killed 100 people? And he said, yes. He said, but I encourage you to leave the town and leave all the actions that you've done. And so this man who has now killed 100 people has decided to do what Pastor Tony had mentioned, and that is to repent and turn back to God and change his way of life. And as he's traveling to this new land to live this nonviolent life, he passes away. And so the angels come down and they measure the distance between where he murdered those 99 people and to the new land where he hoped to start a new nonviolent life. And God actually sent down the angels to measure which one he was closer to, and God expanded it in such a way that he was closer to the land, the new land where he was going to live this nonviolent life and pure life. And so God then forgave him and entered the man who killed 100 people into paradise. What's the point that I'm trying to make? It is one of the greatest responsibilities we have as people who stand for justice is to encourage those who've been a part of the problem to heal themselves through faith. And in the process of them healing themselves through faith and turning back to faith, it's our hope that they can recover, find purpose, and find peace enough to become ambassadors of peace rather than ambassadors of injustice on this earth.
Thank you, Sheikh Tariq. And now, Brahmacharya Shweta.
Yeah, I just want to say that I really resonate with what both of you have said, Pastor Tony and Sheikh Tariq. Really, really important things that you both mentioned, and I definitely learned a lot listening to both of you. Yeah, I would say that I agree that this idea of introspection within oneself, that if at all I have to point out, or I feel that injustice is wrong and I want to point it out outside, well, the first place to look is within. Does that tendency for injustice, that tendency for racism, does that tendency for sexism, does that tendency for whatever it is, does that exist within me? And am I perpetuating certain things, whether I say I do them or not, but am I doing them unconsciously also? I think there's a lot of forms of harm that happen through us that we're also not aware of until someone else points it out to us. And so this sort of constant, and it's not really just, I would hate for this to be an opportunistic thing, that because things are, there is unrest right now, that this is the time where the Advaitin, does this sort of introspection, because I don't think that's the teaching that we get through the Advaita tradition. It is a constant 24/7 introspection. It is a constant looking within of what is it that's barring me from seeing that oneness in my neighbor, from seeing that oneness. And again, within the Advaita tradition, that Brahman expresses not just in all humans, but in literally everything. And so the constant sort of practice is for that person to sort of think through, what is it that I'm doing? What are the ideologies that I hold that are in stark contradiction to this goal that I'm trying to reach? And of course, racial prejudice is certainly one of those contradictions. And so constantly looking within and working on oneself, and that too with the attitude of compassion towards oneself as well. I think this is also an important thing to keep in mind, that as compassionately as we would work, because if we work with ourselves compassionately, we can work with others compassionately. And so as carefully and compassionately as we can work with ourselves in pointing out those prejudices, those biases, and as carefully and honestly as we can do that, I think the idea here is that should spill over then into how we interact with the world around us. And in the Vedanta tradition, there's a very special sort of concept called Shravanam. Shravanam refers to listening, and listening specifically within the textual tradition, listening specifically to the words within the Upanishads, or those statements that reveal this Brahman nature of everything. But when that Shravanam is also described, there are different things that are pointed out, that Shravanam should be done without an air of judgment, that Shravanam should be done with a mind that is open to what's being received. All of these things are part of this concept of Shravanam. And so I think when addressing somebody who may be committing these things, not only does one have to, listen to themselves with this compassion and with this honesty, but also do this sort of Shravanam or active listening for the person that they're talking to. And many times when it's someone that we disagree with, that becomes the hardest thing to do. to listen deeply and actively to things that you absolutely disagree with or you absolutely don't stand for. But within that practice, I think a lot can be revealed. A lot of clarity can also come in terms of what would be an effective way to proceed. And doing that, again, that non-judgment, that honesty, I think are very important aspects here, because the last thing we want to do is be harsh or rash in the way that we are interacting with ourselves and with others. And of course, that should not lead to exacerbating the problem that already exists now. So introspection and shravanam, deep listening.
Thank you, Brahmacharya Shweta. I especially like that you said that this shouldn't just be something we're thinking about now, but something that we should consistently be thinking of. So now we're going to move into the question and answer portion. I know we are a little short for time. So what I did was there was a question that was asked repeatedly by a lot of people that I kind of combined into one. And that is, how should we as believers of faith respond to racism and injustice in our society, whether that's through social justice movements, marches, beginning dialogue within our community, perhaps even violence? What do you think the role of the believer is in this situation? So we'll start with Brahmacharya Shweta on this one.
Sure. Again, I think from the Advaita perspective, I think the underlying concept here is that one should work towards if someone is part of this faith and this is the faith that they are trying to cultivate, then one should work towards, again, engendering the sort of sensitivity towards sorrow. And I think once that becomes a sort of benchmark as to how we then interact with others and the sort of compassion that can engender within us, I think that it doesn't become a matter of if I participate in fighting against injustice or is this, something I should do or not. It just becomes a matter of how do I do it. And I think there's so many different personalities in the world. There's so many different things that we're all adept at, that we're all capable of doing. There's some things we can't do that others can do. And so I think it's about, now that since it's a question of how, then that's something we can all sort of ask ourselves and be very honest about. What is it that I can do that's going to be effective? And that's also going to be something that is something I can actually do. I think this can start even with dialogues at home. This can start with conversation at home. This can start with talking to family members. And this can go all the way to protesting and thinking of, if you're in legislation, I mean, thinking of things that you can propose and you can do. In the different sort of, the different hats that we wear provide different ways in which we can respond to this problem. And everything, I think, counts, and that's something everyone can remember, especially within the Advaita tradition. Every little thing counts. So it's not really about how big of a splash can I make. It's about how am I responding to injustice in the way that I can. And so yes, just to reiterate, it's a matter of not if I do it, but how do I do it?
Thank you, Brahmacharya Shweta. Next, we'll go to Pastor Tony.
Can I just clarify the question is, how do we fight injustices, or how does our faith inform us to fight injustice?
Yeah, or just what is the role of a believer during this time?
Okay. I think maybe one helpful way to think through this, we think that we all have spheres of influence and calling. In some ways you could look at the problems in the world and get overwhelmed and be like, oh my gosh, how do I tackle such a big problem as systemic racism or world poverty? You'd be like, who am I as a human being? And so I think if we break it down into manageable spheres of calling, we have different spheres of calling. I have my family, that's one sphere. I have my church, my faith community. I have my workplace, tends to be a sphere of calling. And then I'd say another sphere is the kind of the public communal sphere. of our local community, our nation. And so we have these different spheres. And I'd say that if we could think about how do I be a voice for justice, speaking against injustice, so I do that at the family, at the dinner table with our family, we talk about these issues. Or at our church, we have forums where we discuss issues of injustice and how can we pursue justice and fight against racism, and what does pursuing more equity look like, things like that. Doing that, pursuing that in the workplace. And then in the public sphere, it depends on our roles. Some of us might be involved in politics and you have ability to influence policy, things like that. I think we want to encourage and support people there. Obviously, one way that we can, at least in our country, which we're thankful for, is to be involved in protests, marches, things like that. We can be involved in those sorts of things. And so those are ways that we can influence that sphere of the state, so to speak. And so I think if we think about it in those ways, all of us are going to have different levels of influence in each of those callings. And so it's just a matter of recognizing, okay, what callings, spheres am I involved with? What places can I have a voice? And where can I be influential? And I think if we break it down that way, it makes it a little bit more manageable in terms of just being practical, I guess.
Thank you, Pastor Tony. Sheikh Dark.
Honestly, they both answered it so wonderfully. I would say that definitely managing it is something that's critical, and recognizing the different circles or spheres is a very helpful tool. I would say one thing that Sweta mentioned that's so critical is listening. A lot of times we want to be, particularly in our time today, it's all about how quickly you can respond to things. I think we need to be less quick and a little bit more measured, a little bit more precise about what our responses look like. So taking the time to listen, taking the time to observe, taking the time to sit at the table and hear things that make us uncomfortable about what we've done, what we can be doing, what other people's experiences have been like, the type of privilege that we might have been living that we couldn't even recognize. And so having those conversations that require us not just to be speaking, but to also be silent and listening. I think that that's something that's really, really critical. Also, another thing that we have is that it's all about making the big moves and the hashtags but really sometimes the most righteous actions you do are the ones that are seen by none but God, right? And so those small actions of influence, right? Supporting a nonprofit that's making sure that people of color are getting an education that facilitates for their long-term success. Supporting a food kitchen, supporting local organizations that need that type of, whether it's financial support or human support, is something that's so critical. And also sitting at the table, not just as a savior, but as someone that needs to be saved. Recognizing that all these people that you're ready to help have a lot that they can give to you, to educate you on, that you can learn from them and benefit from them on. So it's a lot of those small steps, and understanding that, this journey of social justice is not going to be like, a season of your favorite show. It's an extended journey. It's a long process. It took a lot of time for a lot of these injustices to take place, and it's going to take an equal amount of time, if not more, for us to find true justice within our community. And so that's going to require us to be consistent, not opportunistic, like our Honorable Sweta mentioned, and not to be reactionary in a way that it's just a quick fix. It was that, summer 2020, we made it happen, and then you just walk away and nothing really changed. No, this is going to require hard work. This is going to require you to go and do a master's program in a completely different topic than you thought you were going to. This is going to require you to become a lot more informed on who we have creating legislation. This is going to require you to go and engage in communities that you typically, may lock your door and buckle your seatbelt twice. And when you enter those communities, and recognize what those corner stores look like inside. This is going to be a time that demands us to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And going and growing and learning and educating ourselves in a way that's consistent and committed and changes the landscape of our homes and our communities. We were on a listening session with some of the African American Muslims in our community, and it was really humbling to listen in on some of the struggles of the Black brothers and sisters in the Muslim community. And one of them was like, I'm just ready to be invited to your houses. I'm ready to invite you over to some food in my house as well. And I was just so amazed at how something so small could translate into such progress. It's not always going to be Facebook worthy or Instagram friendly, but it can leave a positive mark. So just to kind of sum it up real quick, small steps go a very, very long way. And I'm not just trying to make Hallmark card statements. It's about creating a strategy that's long-term for justice, doing it on an individual level, having conversation. We're all ready to have conversations with the other. Many of us need to be ready to have conversations with ourselves, right? Having those conversations with ourselves, having those conversations like Pastor Tony mentioned, in our houses with our parents about how they feel about maybe the color of our skin or the color of our friend's skin, right? Having those conversations at home, having those conversations in our community centers and our faith centers about maybe what our faith community needs to do differently, and then having the obvious conversations with the public at large and being a part of that voice for change consistently and in a committed way. I think that that's the right course of action, and God knows best.
Thank you, Sheikh Tariq. Hopefully that helped everyone at home kind of figure out what they should be doing during this time. I know there were a lot of questions, and I am sorry that we didn't get to them, but we are going to try and find a way for you guys to ask those questions in some other medium, so keep your eye out for how to do that. So the last question for all of our panelists are just, what did you learn today, or what are your closing remarks that you have for our audience? And we will start with Sheikh Tariq on this one.
Thank you. I really benefited so much, and I think that one of the things that I learned about, very unexpected. Sometimes we get stuck on the present and we don't look at the background, and when our Honorable Sweta was talking about sorrow and sorrow being the root of a lot of our issues, it was a theme that stuck with me tonight. And I don't mean to be repetitive, but it means that there needs to be some time to sit down and process, for me at least, and correct me if I'm saying anything, please, but to really sit down and process what I might be doing as a result of my own sorrow and what might be happening around me because of the sorrow that's existed, and what kind of sorrow am I causing as well. So that's something that really struck with me, that I've learned from the Sweta, and also, the concept of listening and really being a person who's ready to be informed by others, and listening not just with our ears, but listening with our hearts as well. Of course, I always benefit from Pastor Tony, and one thing that I took from him is this understanding of the correlation between our uprightness with God and our uprightness with the creation. And that the connection of the two means that when one is wrong, that means that the other is also in a problematic state. So making sure that we're constantly connecting those two together and revisiting our status with that horizontal line and that vertical line as well.
Thank you, Sheikh Tariq. We'll go to Brahmacharni Shweta next.
Yeah, I think I just have to thank both of you for such a enriching, I know we didn't get to discuss with each other that much, but I think just there's so many enriching insights from both of you. And I'll start with you, Pastor Tony. I think for me, Christianity is new to me. In fact, it was just this last year that I got a little bit more exposure to it. So just hearing from you again, and this is something that strikes me from most Christians that I've talked to, but this trust in Jesus, and that trust in Jesus that can empower a person. I think that is such a powerful thought, and it's such a transformative thought, especially based on the way that you were describing it, and just that faith in God as a driver for life. I really appreciated, and I feel like I learned a lot from how you described all of that. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for those insights, and Sheikh Tariq, you said in the very beginning something about words not expiring. And that I think is just is a wonderful thing. I think it really gives so much, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misinterpreting, but I think it gives so much room for honest interpretation when it comes to us as like seekers of whatever faith we're in and our relationship to the tradition we're a part of. And that is, I think, and just thinking about words not expiring and at the same time being things that we can grapple with over time. I think that's a really powerful thought, and there's a lot of freedom in that too, I think. So I want to thank both of you for yeah, I mean, what an enriching hour and a half I think that was. And I hope that we can chat again. Actually chat, I think, talk to one another. That'd be really nice.
Definitely.
And Arti, thank you for moderating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Pastor Tony.
Yeah. Just want to say thank you to Shweta, Sheikh Tariq, and just great time talking with you all, and learned a lot. I think if I could put it together a little bit, but I'll try to expand. But I think, to me, I felt like one of the powerful moments was when we had to deal with the issue of, like, in some ways, the past sins or injustices of our own faiths. And I think, for us to be honest, about the struggles of the past. But I think something that I hope everyone walked away with is that I think there's caricatures that we can make about, like Muslim people, Hindu people, or maybe Christian people. But, especially I'd say, I think there's unfair caricatures of what a Muslim person is or a Hindu person is, that I hope some of those things are dispelled. And I think they are dispelled by you guys and who you represent in terms of just your kindness, your thoughtfulness, your clarity, I think are powerful things and examples, because again, that's part of the problem, right? Is that we have ideas in our head and we discriminate based on our wrong ideas of what a certain person is. And I think that I appreciate that, when I think of a Muslim or a Hindu, like, we don't have to go to this extreme example that may be a misrepresentation, but to people like you guys would be like my go-tos probably if I have like questions about Islam or Hinduism. And like, can you help me explain, instead of going to some random blog that is just criticizing, unfairly. And I want to go to the source. And I think that this forum created dialogue for that. And I appreciate that about you guys. And, in the Christian faith, we believe in something called common grace, that though we believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and life, that there is a grace that God gives to all humanity of different faiths, and we can learn from one another. And there's those components that I learned from you guys, and things that, I appreciated from hearing from both of you guys about, especially I think both of you said it about listening, the importance of listening to each other, and understanding. And so, I appreciate that I don't want to live by caricatures, but actually talk to the sources, and then let's have discussion based on the fundamentals of our faith. Like, what are the principles? And let's have discussion about that. We may have disagreements about it, but hey, at least we can talk about those things and not these weird extreme stuff that may not really represent the core principles of our faith. And so definitely appreciated that from you guys.
Thank you, Pastor Tony. I'd like to thank all three of you for joining us tonight, Sheikh Tariq, Brahmachari Shweta, and Pastor Tony. It was a really great discussion, and I'm glad that you guys could take time out of your Monday and join us tonight. So that about wraps up our evening. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Design Movement, MSA at UIC, Neighborly Faith, and the Veritas Forum. And again, I would really like to thank our panelists, Sheikh Tariq, Pastor Tony, and Brahmachari Shweta. Thank you guys for being here tonight, really.
Thank you so much. You were a wonderful host. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And for our audience, thank you guys for taking time out of your Monday. A recorded version of tonight's seminar will be available sometime in the next few days, and they'll also be sending out a survey later to ask for feedback about tonight's event and future events that we might hold. We hope to get all three of our panelists back maybe sometime in the near future. And obviously this was a massive topic to fit into an hour and a half, but we're going to try and find a way for you guys to ask your questions. And I'm sure all of our panelists would be happy to help and provide any resources for any questions that you may have. So once again, we'd like to thank all of you guys for coming out tonight. I know there's a lot of other things that you could have been doing tonight, maybe watching Lion King, but I hope that you've learned something about faith and race and injustice, and thank you guys for having me as your host. So thank you, and good night to all of you guys.
Thank you.
Good night, guys.